This is a story of a man named Mark, who considered himself an average man living in the late 20th century, when he volunteered to be hypnotically regressed after having an experience of déjà vu while travelling in Italy the previous year. The details of his regression experience provided fascinating insights into not only his personal psychology, but the times and cultures he appeared to live in centuries past. Mark was in his late 20s when he volunteered for past life regression hypnosis in the 1970s. He lived in the United States and worked at a regular 9-to-5 office job. He was single, well-adjusted, and had an active social life. His hobbies included travel, reading, and experimenting with psychedelic drugs recreationally. Mark had a lifelong interest in spirituality, self-awareness, and consciousness expansion. As a student, he had studied Eastern religions and meditation practices. In college, he took psychology courses exploring concepts like Jungian archetypes, the collective unconsciousness, and personality theories. A year before the past life regressions, Mark had travelled through Europe visiting different countries. While travelling through northern Italy, he came upon a bend in the road that gave him an eerie sense of déjà vu. As he drove up a hill, he saw a small stone building that felt strangely and powerfully familiar, as if he knew and remembered this place from another time. Mark knew he'd seen the building before, then a feeling came over him almost of sadness. He seemed to know the place, and the place had real meaning for him, yet at the same time, he knew it wasn't happy. This experience stayed with Mark and made him curious to understand it. What was behind the uncanny feeling that he had a personal connection to this region of Italy? When he returned home, Mark read upon reincarnation and became fascinated with the idea of accessing past lives through hypnosis. He volunteered for regression therapy, hoping it could help explain his mysterious sense of familiarity with the Italian countryside. Mark had his first past life regression session with the experienced hypnotherapist Helen Wambach in the mid-1970s. They met in the therapist's office for a session scheduled to last 1 to 2 hours. Mark had never been hypnotized before, but proved to be a responsive subject. The therapist began by inducing hypnotic state using standard relaxation and visualization techniques. After a short induction, Mark appeared fully immersed in hypnotic trance. As a test, the therapist regressed Mark back to his 10th birthday and had him describe memories from the party and name the friends who attended. Mark was able to recall vivid sensory details, confirming he was in a genuine hypnotic state. The therapist then instructed Mark to go back further in time, drifting into the distant past. Mark initially reported seeing blurry faces and hazy images slipping by with no concrete scenes. To focus his mind, the therapist told Mark to look down at his body and describe what clothes he was wearing. This orientation technique helps hypnotic subjects get grounded in a past life so they can report back clear details. At first, Mark just saw indistinct shapes and colours, but gradually he reported wearing an old-fashioned uniform of blue and white. He was standing on a cobblestone street, surrounded by other uniformed men. The scene seemed chaotic, with people running in confusion. When asked his name, Mark couldn't recall it, but he saw his friend Pierre standing nearby. Using the technique of having a person in the scene address him by name often works to recover an obscure identity. The therapist asked what his friend Pierre called him. Mark listened and was able to report Paul as his name. Mark described what seemed like a battle unfolding in the streets. He sensed he was a soldier caught up in a conflict. Asked where he was, and Mark responded with certainty, Paris. To move forward in the life story, the therapist guided Mark to the day he died in that lifetime. Mark depicted laying gravely wounded in a large tent with many other soldiers. He felt feverish and on the verge of death. A doctor and monk stood by his bedside. Mark conveyed fear about dying and wanting the monk's blessing. Mark grew restless and showed signs of re-experiencing the trauma of death. The therapist swiftly progressed him forward as a disembodied spirit observing his own burial. Mark watched solemnly as his body was laid on a pile of corpses and respectfully interred. Eager to uncover more lifetimes, the therapist took Mark further back in time, asking what he saw in 1500, then 1450. Suddenly Mark described riding a horse up to a stone castle or fort surrounded by trees. He wore a suit of armour and commanded troops in battle. Mark believed it was the 1400s, and he was a soldier serving the Holy Roman Emperor. The therapist asked many questions to fill out the scene. Mark did not know his name or age. He could not recall having a wife or family in the fortress. His men addressed him as Graf, meaning Lord in German. Mark sensed he was a lonely man with no emotional attachments, which made his life bleak. To find out how he died, the therapist moved him ahead to his deathbed. Mark depicted himself gravely ill and running a high fever in a large hall. He felt terrified about dying. After death, Mark observed in bewilderment as his corpse was sealed into a carved-out space in the castle wall and covered over with stones. Though not a cheerful lifetime, this grim death aligned with Mark's strange feelings upon visiting that region of Italy in present day. The therapist asked what emotions the Italian soldier's lifetime elicited, looking back on it. Mark replied, "It wasn't a very happy life. I was lonely. There was no one I was close to, and it seemed a hard life." At this point, the therapist decided to guide Mark into an interlude of pleasant dreams before inquiring about more pleasant lives. When he awoke refreshed, the journey continued. Travelling back through the 1600s brought no new visions until Mark arrived in the 1700s. Suddenly he described standing barefoot in a pasture, wearing only pants, surrounded by his beloved sheep. Mark's demeanour as a French shepherd boy contrasted sharply with the Italian soldier. He became animated and smiled when talking about the sheep, but answered other questions haltingly with limited cognition. Though he loved his life as a shepherd, Mark did not know where he had lived or any personal details. The therapist asked many questions, trying to anchor the scene in history. Mark vaguely recalled a master named Jean, who once visited him. He had no knowledge of towns, landscapes, or events that could reveal a location. He lived a simple existence in isolation with his flock. Mark found this lifetime intriguing due to the very different consciousness and cognitive abilities exhibited by the shepherd boy. He felt like he was mentally slow yet content in that incarnation. Although lacking education or self-awareness, the shepherd took joy in his animals and outdoor life away from society. After an hour had passed, the therapist emerged Mark from his deep hypnotic trance. Mark remembered fragments, but needed prompting to recall the sequence of lifetimes explored. He was fascinated by the unusual windows into what felt like genuine glimpses into his own past. In the weeks after the session, Mark and the therapist analysed what plausible evidence existed to suggest these lives were historically real versus fabricated by imagination. Could any concrete facts be verified through research? The lifetimes lacked much specific data like dates and full names that could conclusively prove their accuracy, but a few intriguing clues did match with history, as they later discovered. The blue and white French military uniforms Mark depicted corresponded to actual uniforms worn in the late 1800s. Mark's memory of chaotic fighting also aligned with historical archives about the establishment of the Paris Commune and violence in the streets at that time. The Italian soldier's title of Graf, meaning Lord in German, made sense for that medieval region which bordered the Holy Roman Empire. Mark also accurately remembered that different nations did not yet exist in the 1400s, but allegiance was given to rulers like the Holy Roman Emperor. The shepherd life remained an enigma with no verifiable facts, though Mark pointed out he could easily have dreamed up a more exciting role. Instead, he accessed the simpler consciousness, living in nature separate from society. But Mark felt the profound emotional resonance and personal meaning of his experiences indicated some truth beyond just imagination. The hypnotherapist agreed that the powerful impressions and consistencies across Mark's lifetimes warranted an open but discerning mind. In the years following his regressions, Mark integrated these memories into his worldview and understanding of himself. He did not claim absolute certainty that these lifetimes objectively happened, yet his subjective experience had the quality of reliving rather than inventing them. Mark realised his personal psychology and ways of thinking tended to colour how he perceived his past lives. As a man interested in history, he noted details that seemed to fit the time periods. But as someone drawn to nature and peace, you also experience simple lifetimes revolving around sheep. Mark recognised that his current attitudes about religion shaped the death experiences and need for blessings he recounted. In the Italian lifetime, his Catholic upbringing clearly influenced fearing judgment upon dying. Ultimately, Mark kept an open, curious mind to life's deeper mysteries. The memories resonated as meaningful whether they came from his subconscious or an actual metaphysical dimension. Mark integrated these past lives into his sense of identity without clinging to them as defining his present reality. They expanded his self-concept and appreciation that consciousness endures beyond one's fleeting incarnation. Mark's story provides an intriguing window into the world of past life regressions and their role in self-discovery. Reincarnation resonates with an inner logic, even across cultures and centuries. The idea that souls experience multiple lives across time can open minds and hearts to life's complexity. Mark's story suggests we each hold connections between lifetimes, both lived and yet to come.